Let's be plain. Our country appears ill. The failed ideas of history seem astonishingly to be metastasizing in the body politic and culture. What we thought could not happen here is happening here. And while we see it, we don't fully understand how such destructive ideas could be sold to free people. We are especially disheartened to hear from the mouths of bright people, people we love, people we work with, the championing of ideas that ignore human nature, cold-heartedly disrespect the individual, and have left a legacy of immeasurable suffering. Tonight, we take a look at our current fight to preserve liberty from a different perspective, a psychological one, from a man with a profound credibility to speak to such things. Currently a professor of marketing at John Molson School of Business and prolific author, Dr. Saad has an impressive resume filled with significant academic and professional accomplishments and awards, including over 75 scientific papers, many at the intersection of evolutionary psychology and a broad range of disciplines, including consumer behavior, marketing, advertising, psychology, medicine, and economics. His Psychology Today blog and YouTube channel, The Saad Truth, have millions of views, and I encourage you to check out both his engaging podcast and his latest book, The Parasitic Mind. So yes, it is this professor's mind, but also his background that makes him uniquely qualified to warn of the dangers we now face. He knows firsthand the misery and frankly, depravity and inhumanity created by tribalism and the mechanisms by which such bad ideas take hold. Born Jewish in Beirut, Lebanon, Gad Saad is one of the best known public intellectuals fighting the tyranny of political correctness. It is precisely because this courageous psychologist is unwilling to stand by as the collective suicidal insanity and nonsensical utopian speak offered is being swallowed as science that we invited him here to address the forum tonight. Joining us from Canada is a warm man with an admirably fierce heart. Dr. Saad, welcome to the Liberty Forum.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jane. And thank you for everyone who's attending. I'm really excited to deliver this talk. I wish it could have been in person, but hopefully in the future we will try again. So the title of my book is The Parasitic Mind. And what I will try to do in the next 45 minutes is give you a quick summary of some of the key ideas in the book to help us understand why we are facing the slow walk, if not fast walk, fast gallop toward the abyss of infinite lunacy. But let me start with some good news. This is, I think, my second foray into Silicon Valley discussing some of these issues. And so I pulled out the first foray, which was in the belly of the beast. This was a talks at Google. I mean, if you want to talk about where some of these parasitic ideas are flourishing, it would certainly be within the ecosystem of the social media companies. And yet, to their credit, they were kind enough to invite me back in 2017 to speak on my scientific work at the intersection of evolutionary psychology and consumer behavior. And certainly based on the like to dislike ratio, all hope is not lost. Many people in Silicon Valley have not become lobotomized. And so let's continue that trend. So as an evolutionary psychologist, one of the things that I do if I'm trying to understand something about human phenomena is to look for other analogous phenomena in nature. And so the topic of the book is parasitic ideas. And so I thought, if I'm going to use the parasitology framework to study these bad ideas, I should delve into the field of pathogens and parasitology. And so if you look at the greatest threats that humanity has ever faced, it's not the great white shark, it's not the grizzly bear or the lion. It's usually in the form of various pathogens, be it bacteria or viruses or parasites or fungi. And of course, we're currently still in the throes of a global pandemic. But I argue, of course, that much before COVID, for the past 40, 50 years, we've been suffering some unbeknownst to many people, from a global pandemic of the human mind. And so this is what I call idea pathogens or mind pathogens. So these are ideas, beliefs, attitudes, and mindsets that parasitize one's ability to think properly via the use of reason, logic, science, evidence-based thinking, and so on. So if we look at, there are many, many great examples of neuroparasites in nature. Neuroparasites are parasites that ultimately reside in the host's brain, right? So you could have many parasites. For example, a tapeworm can end up in your intestinal tract, but in neuroparasites look for, to alter the host's neuronal circuitry to its advantage. So take, for example, here we have a spider wasp, which will sting the hapless spider, rendering it zombified, but fully alive. And it will drag it to its burrow, fully alive, lay an egg, and then when the egg hatches, it eats the spider while the spider is fully alive. And I argue that political correctness is akin to the spider wasp sting. It slowly and quietly leads us, instead of the burrow, into the abyss of infinite lunacy, where up is down, left is right, where people menstruate, not women menstruate, where mothers are now called birthing people, and so on and so forth. Examples, classic example of neuroparasites, before I come to the actual parasitic ideas that I discuss in the book. Here's one great example that some of you may have heard of. Toxoplasma gondii is a parasite. Actually, it can infect the brains of humans, but the most famous example is when a mouse is parasitized by Toxoplasma gondii. It loses its innate fear of cats, and it actually becomes sexually attracted to the cat's urine. That's not a very good attraction to hold if you're a mouse. But again, from the perspective of the parasite, it is helpful to its reproductive interest. Here's another example, P. tenuis. It's a brain parasite that infects the brains of ungulates, moose, elk, deer. And so the ungulate that is parasitized by this particular brainworm will oftentimes engage in a circling behavior. So they can't extricate themselves from this sort of motor pattern where they just kind of haplessly bob their head and go around in a circle. And even if the looming predators are approaching, they can't extricate themselves. They're fully parasitized. And so that gives you, if you like, the biological analogy to what I then talk about. Instead of talking about actual brainworms, I talk about idea brainworms, if you'd like. So what are some examples of these idea brainworms? And here, forgive me, my eyesight is failing me, so I need to put on the glasses. So this is a figure from the first chapter of the Parasitic Mind. So radical or militant feminism is an idea pathogen. This is probably the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, postmodernism, because it purports that there are no objective truths. We are completely shackled by subjectivity and personal biases. Social constructivism, the idea that everything is a social construction. Cultural and moral relativism, political correctness, echo chambers void of intellectual diversity, the culture of perpetual offense and victimhood, identity politics, along with progressive self-flagellation. Each of these dreadful idea pathogens were spawned on university campuses. As I often like to remind people, it takes intellectuals to come up with some of the dumbest ideas, and that's why all of these parasitic ideas were spawned in the university context. Jane referred to my background, and so let me build on what she said. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and I grew up there the first 11 years of my life, and we were part of the last very small remaining group of Jews that had steadfastly refused to leave Lebanon. But then in 1975, when the civil war broke out, we went from this in Beirut to this in Beirut. And so the things that I saw in my time in Lebanon is more than what 10,000 people should ever have to see in their lives. But what that allowed me to recognize many, many years later is the dangers of identity politics, because Lebanon is exactly what happens to a society that is perfectly organized along identity political lines. In the case of Lebanon, it's based on your religious heritage. As a matter of fact, in Lebanon, you have internal ID cards, not unlike passports. And on the internal ID card is very conspicuously stated your religion. And so if you were a Jew, there weren't many militia roadblocks that you were going to clear. Typically what would happen in Lebanon, there'd be these random ad hoc militia roadblocks. And if you were of the wrong religious group, you were gone. And so as a Jew, there weren't many of these that you were going to clear. And so I had a very, very vivid appreciation, if not disdain, for what identity politics is. And so you can imagine how disheartening it is for me to see that under the cloak of progressivism, the United States and certainly Canada is trying to reintroduce identity politics as a progressive idea. Nothing could be less progressive than that. Of course, another thing that is happening in the university context. So I always argue, by the way, that there are two great wars that I have faced in my life. The first one is what I mentioned in the previous slide, the Lebanese Civil War. The second great war that I have experienced is the war on reason and science as a professor of almost 3 decades. I became a professor in 1994, straight out of my PhD. And what first began as an attack on some of the ideas that I was proposing in my scientific work, for example, the idea that consumers are biological beings shaped by evolutionary forces, most social scientists thought that was completely heretical. Surely you don't mean, Dr. Saad, that the same phenomena that, or the same principles that drive the behavior of the mosquito and the zebra and the dog also explain human behavior? Well, yes, there is nothing unique about humans that makes us operate outside the realm of our biology. And so that was my first inkling that there was really sort of this dogmatic religious fervor within academia to refuse discussion of certain ideas. For example, ideas that were considered forbidden knowledge. Don't study sex differences, don't study racial differences, don't study anything that might hurt someone's feelings as a downstream consequence. And therefore, feelings trump facts. We condemn freedom of speech that hurts other people's feelings. Well, that's quite a ridiculous position to take. One should take a deontological position when it comes to the pursuit of truth. Sure, you don't want to go out of your way to hurt people, but if in the pursuit of truth, someone's feelings are hurt, so be it. Now, I have personally faced a lot of these, don't say this and don't say that because you might hurt someone's feelings. So in 2017, both myself and Jordan Peterson were scheduled to speak at a event titled The Stifling of Free Speech on University Campuses. And it was to be held on a university campus at Ryerson University in Ontario, Canada. Well, guess what happened to the event that was called The Stifling of Free Speech on University Campus? It was stifled. So the irony was lost on them. Several other such examples. This very famous situation happened when I appeared in front of the Canadian Senate to discuss some of the slippery slope elements of what was then called, it's still called Bill C-16, but at the time it hadn't yet passed. Bill C-16 is the bill that sought to incorporate gender identity and gender expression under the rubric of hate crime laws. And of course, my position was not that transgender people shouldn't be protected and that they shouldn't live lives full of dignity. Of course, I support that, but that there were slippery slope outcomes that would, if we didn't think hard about some of these issues. So for example, as an evolutionary psychologist, I study sexual selection, which is the mechanism that generates sex differences for sexually reproducing species. Well, if we now have 873 genders, could someone argue that my teaching evolutionary biological principles or evolutionary psychology would be, quote, transphobic? So it was a very sober presentation that I delivered in front of the Canadian Senate. And this particular senator, who was actually a senator from Quebec, what he took away is that I was promulgating a pro-genocide position against transgender people, to which I retorted, he might want to be careful about accusing someone of being pro-genocide when that person has escaped execution in Lebanon. But this is the kind of discourse we face in the public arena today. Much more recently, last month, I was speaking at the Jewish Public Library, and some super progressive and empathetic progressive Jews were trying to cancel the Lebanese Jew who escaped execution in Lebanon from speaking at the Jewish Public Library. So we had reached sort of the singularity point of wokeism. To their credit, the Jewish Public Library refused to cave. The deplatforming attempts were not successful. And of course, the event went, with no problems, and there were no complaints. But that's the kind of reality you face in today's world. And so you truly have to have strong testicular and intestinal fortitude if you're going to be a player in this public arena of ideas, because it can get truly vicious out there. All right, so to give you again a sense of how insane some of these realities are, here's a article that was written by a very liberal professor, Edward Schlosser, and he basically says, "I'm a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me." I won't read all of these quotes, but basically what he's saying is that, all of the professors that he can think of now always teach their material in such a way as to try to minimize the likelihood of uttering a single syllable that might be construed as offensive to anyone. So it is no longer about intellectual enrichment. It's no longer about intellectual growth. It truly is a game where you try to teach in such a way as to minimize the possibility that anybody can come after you. And these are very, very progressive and liberal professors who are saying this. Continuing with this idea of sort of the sterile environment that we see in universities, this is, let me just kind of give you the background to this. This is something called the hygiene hypothesis, which comes from evolutionary medicine. So if you think about children who might suffer from autoimmune diseases, say asthma, well, it turns out that children who have grown up in environments where they are exposed to allergens, right? Where they, for example, pet dander, or they grew up on a farm where there's a lot of dust, those children end up having fewer cases of asthma because your immune system expects to be triggered by these allergen and these pollutants. On the other hand, if you grow up in a very antiseptic, sterile environment, then you're more likely to suffer from asthma. And so this brilliant neuropsychiatrist from Australia, this gentleman right here, analogized that principle to the concept of having sterile echo chambers where ideas are not debated. And so I take this principle in my book, The Parasitic Mind, and I argue that in the same way that our lungs, to fully function, have to be exposed developmentally to pollutants, well, the prefrontal cortex right here of our big brains expects to be, quote, triggered by pollutants and allergens, in this case called opposing ideas. For our, for us to have maximal ability to think and engage in critical thinking, we need to be exposed to opposing positions. And yet what we've created at our universities is exactly the antithesis of that, which is only one possible position is ever allowed. And to demonstrate this empirically, this is a fantastic study published a few years ago by Langbert, where he looked, I know this is very small, you can't see it, the exact numbers don't matter, but what I can tell you is, he looked at the political affiliation of professors, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, across a whole bunch of disciplines. And in many disciplines, you have ratios of 133 to 0, 78 to 1. So we're not talking, in medicine, for example, if you have an odds ratio of 2 to 1, that's a hugely powerful, statistically significant effect. You're not talking here about 1.2 to 1 ratio or 2 to 1 ratio. You're talking 78 to 1, 100 to 1. So imagine in certain fields where it's not, scientific facts that are being addressed. Is the death penalty a good idea or a bad idea? What should be the optimal foreign policy that a country espouses? What should be the optimal fiscal policy? Well, there are valuable positions irrespective of which, where you fit on the spectrum of, the political spectrum. And so you are cheating your students from a good education if you have fields where you have 80 to 1 and 100 to 1 Democrat to Republican. So it really behooves one to understand how someone with any amount of intellectual honesty could argue that it's completely overblown when people say that there is a liberal bias on campus. I mean, you couldn't make up data that is any more convincing than that. 100 to 30 to 0 ratio is something that you debate in terms of whether there's a liberal bias or not. What would a liberal bias have to look like if it isn't exactly that? This is what's happening in Canada, but it's also happening all over the West. So now this is, so many of you have heard the terms diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so I coined these precisely because oftentimes when you coin something in a powerful way, it becomes sticky. People remember it. And so I call it the DIE religion. DIE stands for diversity, inclusion, and equity, because the DIE religion is where meritocracy goes to die. So now we no longer bestow academic awards, professorships. Even in this case, what I'm showing you on the screen is Canada Research Chairs. This is where the Canadian government is endowing the highest possible chaired professorship. So this is, you know, the epitome, the apex of academic, you know, elite positions. And yet these are now being given out as a function of whether I am a person of color or I'm transgender or I'm indigenous and so on. It is grotesque. It is a cancer to individual dignity. And until we have the courage to, you know, fight back against these ideas, the academy is going to continue to suffer. And I can assure you that in my case, I held a university-wide chaired professorship for 10 years. And over the past 4 years since I last held it in 2018, I've applied 4 years in a row to get the chair, which should have been a no-brainer based on objective metrics. But as you probably all know, meritocracy now is a form of white supremacy. And so unfortunately, I haven't gotten the chair again. Continuing with some of these downstream effects of all of these idea pathogens, in the book, I talk about something that I call collective Munchausen and the homeostasis of victimology. So these are quite a couple of mouthfuls, and so let me break them down for you. Munchausen syndrome is something that I had written about back in 2010 in a medical journal. Munchausen syndrome refers to a psychiatric disorder whereby someone feigns an illness so that they can garner the empathy and sympathy that comes with being a sufferer of that illness. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is even more diabolical, but because this is where you take someone who's under your care, your pet, your elderly parent, but most often your biological child, and you harm them so that you can garner the empathy and sympathy by proxy. And so typically the person who is arrested for those particular ugly realities will often be the biological mother of the child. And so I was already familiar with this concept, having written about it scientifically. And so as I saw the orgiastic desire, this kind of runaway selection of people trying to outdo each other in terms of who is the greatest victim. And of course, in many cases, it was manufactured victimhood. It was faux victimhood. It was hoax victimhood, right? I faced real victimhood, right? I ran really fast so that my head wouldn't be detached from the rest of my body in Lebanon. And so, but Jussie Smollett was not satisfied with being a highly paid actor and by all metrics, a successful person. To truly be successful, he had to have an apex victimology story. And if he's not a victim, then he will certainly go out of his way to construct one. And in the case of noble victim Elizabeth Warren, she engages in collective Munchausen by proxy. She usurps the true victimhood of another people's, pretends that she is of that people, because then she can surf, wave ride the victimhood, you know, to getting a job at Harvard as the first woman of color to have gotten tenure at Harvard and so on. And so the ethos becomes not I think, therefore I am, as René Descartes explained to us, but I'm a victim, therefore I am. The homeostasis of victimology refers to the following idea. This is, again, something that I discuss in the Parasitic Mind. So if you think, for example, of your thermostat in your hotel room, It's a homeostatic system. You set the temperature at 70 degrees, and then the thermostat will gauge the temperature and either make the room cooler or hotter so that you can maintain that 70 degrees desired level. Well, many systems in our bodies are homeostatic. If my blood sugar goes down, it sends a signal to my brain, raid the fridge and eat something. And so I argue that what's happened with our orgiastic desire for victimhood in the zeitgeist of the West is that we set a threshold of the narrative that you know, the US or Canada are homophobic, Islamophobic, transphobic, white supremacist nations, and we need to reach that level, desired level, to meet our narrative. And if we can't find instantiations to support that narrative, then we will redefine what constitutes bigotry so that we can reach that set level. And hence, in that sense, it's a homeostasis of victimology. And let me give you two very vivid examples of this phenomenon. There was a student in Canada at Queen's University who wanted to demonstrate that Canada is a deeply Islamophobic country. And so she donned a hijab. She doesn't wear the hijab, but she donned the hijab for, I think, 18 days because she wanted to then document, you know, all of the Islamophobic incidents that would befall her. Well, it turns out that everybody was incredibly kind and sweet and polite and lovely to her. So what did she do? If she were a honest student of human behavior, she would have revised her position in light of incoming information. No, what she argued is, aha, the fact that Canadians were so kind and polite to me dressed in a hijab meant that they were compensating for their latent Islamophobia. So if they had been Islamophobic, that would have proved that they were Islamophobic. When they are the exact opposite of Islamophobic, that also proves that they are Islamophobic. One other quick example, a doctoral student in Israel wanted to document, Jewish doctoral student, it's relevant to the story, wanted to document that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, engages in systematic raping of Palestinian women. So she went out to collect such data. To her utter dismay, she found out that there weren't any documented instances, no documented, not one, of rape of Palestinian women. So did she alter her view? Did she give them a medal for their humanity? No. The Israeli soldiers were so dehumanizing the Palestinian women that those women weren't even worthy of rape. So to rape women is horrible, and to not rape women demonstrates how bad you are. That's the world we live in today. So continuing with this idea of victimology narrative, we often hear, you know, we need programs to help women in universities because, you know, we need allies for women because, you know, women at universities in Canada and the US are no different than, you know, facing the Taliban. It is such a dangerous world at Berkeley and Stanford for women that we need to find a systematic way to create allyship programs. By the way, I was asked to deliver a speech by a very prominent group where I was supposed to talk about how I had been an ally to women. And my answer was, well, I haven't been an ally to women. I've been an ally to every single person, whether they're women, not women, men, whether they're purple or green, whether they're transgendered or not. I don't modulate my allyship based on your reproductive status or genitalia status. And I said, I'd be happy to deliver a lecture on the evolutionary roots of sex differences. They weren't willing to have me speak about that. I had to only speak about how I was a good ally to women, which, by the way, I argued also in the Parasitic Mind that, boy, is that insulting to women, right? I mean, they need me to coddle them and infantilize them. Women need me as an ally. My dean is a woman. My chair of my department is a woman. The associate dean of research is a woman. They don't need me as an ally. That's insulting to people to treat them as though they are children in need of me saving them. But that's, again, the victimology narrative that we live in. But just to use this little thing called pesky data to test some of these victimology narratives. This is data from the US government. It basically looks at 4 levels of educational attainment: associate's degree, which is half a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctoral degree, across 5 racial categories. So the table is basically 20 cells, 4 levels of education by 5 races. And for each of these cells, the US government has calculated the ratio of men to women that have graduated within each of these cells. So if the narrative of rampant misogyny on university campuses were true, then in 20 out of the 20 cells, you would have men outnumbering women. What is the actual data? You want to take a guess? I guess I can't field your guesses. In 20 out of the 20 cells, women outnumbered men. In other words, you couldn't have data that is more falsifying of the victimhood narrative, and yet we still hang on to the victimhood narrative that we need to protect women in this hotbed of patriarchy called universities. Now, when I say this, this is not to negate the fact that in the past, that reality was true. Women were stopped from being equal participants in education, but we worked hard to redress that situation. Intellectually honest people will alter their positions in light of incoming evidence. That's what makes science so beautiful, right? There's a provisional truth, and then it is falsified, and then we're back to the drawing board. But when you are imbued with the desire, the intoxicating desire to always be a victim, who cares about data? We just have to constantly cry victimhood. All right, let's keep going. This is an example that some of you may, if you follow my work, have heard me mention before, but others may not know it, so it's worth repeating. In one scoop, this will explain to you the dangers of several of idea pathogens, but most notably postmodernism. Now remember, postmodernism, I argued, is the granddaddy of all idea pathogens because it is, if you like, a form of intellectual terrorism because it negates the possibility of having an epistemology of truth, right? Because there is no objective truth. Everything is shackled by personal biases, by subjectivity, by relativism. So it's silly, according to postmodernism, to talk about any objective truth. So in 2002, one of my doctoral students had just defended his dissertation. And so we were going out for a celebratory dinner. Myself, my wife, the doctoral student in question, and his date for the evening. The student in question calls me up before the evening, we're going out to dinner, and he tells me, just a heads up, the woman that's coming with me is a graduate student in, militant feminism, women's studies, cultural anthropology, and postmodernism, which I call the holy trinity of BS. And so I understood this to mean, let's not have a nasty debate. Let's have a good, I said, oh, I got you, no problem. I'll be on my best behavior, which of course wasn't a promise that I was going to keep. And so about halfway through the evening, I turned to the lady in question. I said, I hear you're a postmodernist. Yes. Well, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so I do think that there are objective truths. I do think that there are human universals that unite us under a shared biological heritage. So do you mind if I propose what I consider to be some objective truths and then you can correct me? She goes, yeah, go for it. Okay, is it not an objective truth that within Homo sapiens, humans, it is women who bear children? Is that not a truth? So she scoffs at my simple mind, at my stupidity, at my misogyny, and says, absolutely not. Oh, so it's not true that only women bear children. Can you explain that to me? She goes, well, there is a tribe off some Japanese island where within their mythology, within the realm of their myths, their cultural myths, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting the conversation to the biological realm, that's how you keep us, barefoot and pregnant. So once I recovered from the mini stroke at having faced that level of stupidity, I then said, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't propose something quite as corrosive as contentious as women bear children. So let me take a less poisonous example. Is it true from any vantage point on Earth that sailors have since time immemorial relied on the fact that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And in a second, you'll understand why I have here a dancing hyena. So she said, here she used something called deconstructionism from Jacques Derrida, one of the French postmodernists. Deconstructionism is basically language creates reality, right? So these are just arbitrary labels. And so she said, well, what do you mean by east and west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena. I said, well, fine. The dancing hyena rises in the east and the dancing hyena sets in the west. She said, well, I don't play those label games. Now, why do I always tell this story? Because she wasn't some escapee from a mental institution. She was an escapee from postmodernist graduate training, right? She was just aping everything that we now see as part of regular parlance. Up is down, left is right, boys menstruate, and so on and so forth. What the quote epistemology that allows this gaslighting, if you like, to take place is exactly postmodernism. And that's why I refer to it as the ultimate form of intellectual terrorism. Continuing with a few idea pathogens, one of the things that maybe to my chagrin is that my satire, for those of you who are familiar with my work, I often use satire because satire is truly a very powerful way to point to, absurdities. And so several years ago, and now the reality is oftentimes my satire proves prophetic. And so a few years ago, I had satirically, although when I deliver these things, if you don't know my work, you may not think that I'm being satirical. I had announced that I had founded a new discipline called social justice mathematics. I have a background in mathematics, by the way. And so I basically created this new field, complete nonsense, where I was arguing, for example, that we shouldn't anymore refer to numbers as irrational numbers because that marginalizes and stigmatizes mental illness. We shouldn't talk about the inequality operator because that's ableist, all the buzzword of the blue-haired people. And then several years later, I folded my arms, waited for reality to catch up to my satire, and now we do have social justice mathematics. So here's a professor who basically argued that mathematics is white supremacy, right? This is what kids are being taught. Kids from as young as elementary school all the way to universities are being taught these days. Here's an example of a movement called, so there's something called hashtag science must fall, the idea being that the scientific method is only one way of knowing, which, by the way, is tainted by the fact that many of the folks who developed the epistemology of the scientific method are white men, and therefore, by its very nature, it must be suspect. And so the University of Cape Town a few years ago argued that you shouldn't be teaching Newton and Descartes and Francis Bacon and Charles Darwin, because what do all these guys have in common? They're all white men. Therefore, hashtag science must fall. There are other ways of knowing. And so the Quebec minister, since I come from Quebec, the Quebec deputy minister at one point had argued, well, when you're doing environmental impact studies, shouldn't you only be relying on the scientific method to adjudicate these issues? And he was almost canceled and, apologize and grovel and all this because he was denigrating the possibility that there are other equally valid ways of knowing. For example, the indigenous way of knowing. Now, let me make a distinction here. If indigenous people have lived in a particular land for 10,000 years, they may have content-specific knowledge, say about the flora and fauna, that is unique to their lived experience, right? They've lived on that land for 10,000 years. So you can go to indigenous people and say, please help us understand these certain flora or fauna realities. But the manner by which you test any hypothesis, by which you apply the scientific method, there is no Lebanese Jewish way of knowing. There is no transgender Hasidic way of knowing. There is no indigenous way of knowing. There's the scientific method. That's what makes the scientific method the great epistemology that the world has as a gift, because it liberates us from our personal identities. That's what makes us all equal participants in the beauty and majesty of science. And yet now a deputy minister is almost canceled for arguing, for defending the scientific method when it comes to adjudicating issues dealing with environmental impact studies. So this is not something that is restricted to some esoteric humanities department. That's what I would often get when I first started to weigh in on these issues publicly. People would write to me and say, Dr. Saad, aren't you exaggerating how serious the issue is? Isn't this just restricted to a few, quacks in some humanities department? No. Our Prime Minister in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, is a walking manifestation of every idea pathogen that I discuss in the Parasitic Mind, right? Our daily lives are impacted by the policies that he enacts precisely because he's been parasitized by all of these imbecilic ideas. Moving on, I'll take a few more minutes. Let me see how much. Yeah, maybe I'll need about another 10 minutes if you don't mind. In chapter 6 of my book, I talk about a very serious malady, which I coined as Ostrich parasitic syndrome. This is where, of course, the metaphor being that the ostrich buries its head in the sand because it doesn't want to face reality. Now, of course, the ostrich doesn't actually do this, but the metaphor has become apt enough that the meaning of the metaphor stands. And so there are all sorts of ways by which otherwise nuanced and progressive thinkers suffer from OPS. And in the book, I discuss several such examples, but most famously, here's the example that I'd like to go over. So if you look at patterns of terrorism around the world, so there are several very, very thorough databases, global databases that keep track of every single manifestation of a terror attack around the world. And so here there is, I think, 67 or up to now 70 countries that vary on every possible metric that you could think of, culturally, ethnically, racially, politically, economically. So they kept track of all the terrorist attacks in these countries. They kept track of the motives that the terrorists gave for why they committed those acts. But apparently what the terrorists gave as their motive was wrong. It was not true. Instead, what our bien-pensants, as we say in French, or the ones with pure thoughts, the ones who are smarter than you and me, that are more nuanced in their thinking, said, no, this has nothing to do with their noble faith, where they quoted the exact passages from their noble book to justify why they did this in the 67 to 70 countries. By the way, 36,000 plus terror attacks since 9/11 alone. No, it's due to lone wolfism. It's a man-made disaster. It's because they watch violent video games. It's because they weren't sufficiently exposed to art. Had they been freed by the beauty of Godin and Picasso, they wouldn't have blown up the cafe in Paris. It's because they study engineering. It's because of beard bullying. It's because of climate change. As the science guy Bill Nye explained to us, the Bataclan massacre, where almost 200 people were killed in a concert hall in Paris, was quite conceivably due to solar panels and carbon emissions. So this is the kind of lunacy that you face. It's not what the terrorists told you why they did it. It's because of climate change and solar panels. Couple of more idea pathogens, and then I'll try to wrap it up for you. Social constructivism, as I said, is another idea pathogen because it argues that we are born with empty minds, void of any biological blueprints, and it is only socialization that makes us who we are. And a related idea pathogen is what I call biophobia. Biophobia is the fear of using biology to explain human phenomena. So, and hence tabula rasa, empty slate premise. Okay. Now, why do I have this image here from an actual ad campaign? Is because if you believe tabula rasa, then you think that toy preferences, the sex specificity of toy preferences, have no biological signature. It's only all of the collective sexist parents who impose these toy preferences on little Johnny. But if some smart advertiser or toy manufacturer teaches this boy to play with dolls, then he will acquiesce and oblige. And if we can only teach little girls to play with with trucks and with guns, then they will be able to bench press as much as men, because there are no morphological, anatomical, biological, behavioral differences between men and women. It's all due to a social construction. So how would I go about demonstrating the complete lunacy of this position? So this is what I talk about, and this is, if you don't mind me saying, a incredibly powerful epistemological tool for how to seek truth. This is what I call nomological networks of cumulative evidence. It's a mouthful, so let me explain the concept and then I'll give a brief explanation. So I want to prove to you that toy preferences do have a biological basis. They're not due to just the vagaries of social construction. So what I would want to do then is try to find as many distinct lines of evidence, all of which, when they are triangulated, create a tsunami of evidence that otherwise drowns your position. In other words, I don't need to emote louder than you. I don't need to be hysterical. I simply put on my epistemological hat of someone who wants to build such a nomological network, and then I will drown you in evidence. So I won't go through all of these different lines of evidence, but I'll give you a few so that you can get a sense of how we seek truth using this very powerful methodology. So one of the things that I look for when I'm building these kinds of networks is to look for data across cultures, across time periods, across disciplines, across methodologies, all of which come to the same final conclusion. So it becomes very, very difficult if you're holding the opposing viewpoint to hang on to that position. So for example, I could show you data from developmental psychology where we take infants who are too young to be socialized by definition, and they are already exhibiting those sex-specific toy preferences. So already the data from this box is sufficient to falsify the idea that toy preferences are a social construction. But I won't stop there. That's the beauty of this methodology. I can get you data from across cultures, from cultures that are very, very different from Western cultures, and show you that the toy preferences of little boys and little girls are exactly the same as those of little boys and girls in the West. I can get you data from pediatric endocrinology, where you take little girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is a endocrinological disorder that masculinizes the behaviors of little girls who suffer from this affliction. Well, what happens to their toy preferences? They become similar to those of boys. So bit by bit, I am tightening, if you forgive the violent imagery, I am tightening the epistemological noose around your neck. I'm not screaming, I'm not hysterical, I'm not calling you racist. I'm simply systematically getting you data from across cultures, across time periods, across methodologies to show you that my position is veridical. And so this becomes a very, very powerful tool to navigate through many of the important societal issues that we talk about. So in chapter 7 of The Parasitic Mind, I use this methodology, this epistemological methodology, to argue whether Islam is a peaceful religion or a violent religion. And so this is the phenomenon that I'm trying to explain. Is Islam peaceful or not? And then I'm going to try to find you data that either supports one position or the other. So there you go, almost done. So how do we save our universities? And again, the reason why I focus on universities is because they are the originators of all of these bad ideas. Now, of course, these bad ideas are now in our HR departments, they are in our military, they're in our political parties, they're everywhere, they're in every nook and cranny, but they all began at the universities. So it's really a long game. In other words, if we're going to win this battle, we have to reverse what is being taught at universities. And that's why I ask people to always activate their inner honey badger, meaning that they have to become dogged defenders of principles that they believe in. Don't subcontract the hard work to others. So let me just kind of quickly read through these, and then I just have one long quote to read, and then we'll be done, and I'll be happy to take your questions. So number 1, pursue knowledge unencumbered by ideological activism. No knowledge is forbidden if gathered objectively using the scientific method. The calculus of don't do this research because it might somewhere down the line hurt someone's feeling is a terribly dangerous instinct to hold. Okay, this would be like arguing we should have gotten rid of physics because physics led to the atomic bomb. Without physics, we could have never dropped those bombs, and so therefore cancel physics because of atomic bombs. So this is not arguing that, you know, be cavalier about the consequences of your knowledge, but if you are a truth seeker, and certainly as a professor, that's what I am mandated to do, I don't modulate what I study and what I say as a function of whether it might hurt someone's feelings. Number two, no more identity politics. Instead, promote the dignity of the individual rather than supporting oppression Olympics and what I call victimology poker. By the way, one of the reasons why, so oftentimes people say, how come you're able to exist in academia? You're by far the most frontally vociferous person who attacks every possible sacred cow, and yet you're not canceled. Well, knock on wood, I think one of the reasons why I'm not canceled is because I hold the top hand in victimology poker. Because if you're going to come to me with your faux victimology story, I'm going to outrank you given my personal history, which, by the way, is grotesque that I actually would use this calculus. But that's what happens with the blue-haired people. They don't debate you on the merits of your position, but rather who's the greatest victim. And on that end, I win. Number three, no more coddling of the culture of offense and the ethos of perpetual victimhood. No microaggressions, no trigger warnings, no safe spaces, no culture appropriation. Life is your trigger warning. That's what I tell my students. If you're going to be triggered by me talking about sex differences, get out of the course. A just society is rooted in the ethos of meritocracy. We are not social ants. Why did I say this? E.O. Wilson, the famous evolutionary biologist, stated famously when asked about communism and socialism, he said, great idea, wrong species. Why? Because social ants are communists. Why? Because there is one queen and all of the other ants are there with equal positions in the hierarchy servicing the queen. But we're not social ants. We are a hierarchical species. Promote an ethos of intellectual and political diversity. All ideas, beliefs, and ideologies are open to criticism, debate, mocking, ridicule, and other forms of scrutiny, short of direct incitement to violence. Eradicate hate speech laws, university speech codes, codes regarding hostile environments, and all the rest of the nonsense. Science, reason, logic, and a commitment to evidence-based thinking, trump ideology, hurt feelings, and fashionable anti-science, faux intellectual gibberish. And then I will end with this because this is one of the ways by which people are afraid to speak because they're deadly afraid of being called racist. So let me read this quote, which comes toward the end of my book. To criticize Islam does not make you an Islamophobe, a nonsensical term, nor a hater of individual Muslims. To scrutinize radical feminism does not make you a misogynist. To question open borders does not make you a racist. You can have an open heart filled with empathy and compassion and yet reject open borders. To assert that trans women, biological males, should not be competing in athletic competitions with biological females does not make you a transphobe. Many situations in life involve a calculus of competing rights. With that in mind, the right of your 8-year-old daughter to feel comfortable and safe in a public bathroom supersedes that of a 230-pound, 6'2" trans woman. To reject the idea that so-called other forms of knowing, whether the indigenous way of knowing or postmodernism, are as valid as the scientific method does not make you a closed-minded bigot. To reject the hysterical demonization of white men as exemplars of toxic masculinity and white supremacy does not make you Adolf Hitler. The name-calling accusations are locked and loaded threats ready to be deployed against you should you dare to question the relevant progressive tenets. Most people are too afraid to be accused of being racist or misogynist, and so they cower in silence. Keep your mouth shut and nod in agreement, or else prepare to be tarred and feathered. Don't fall prey to the silencing strategy. Be assured in your principles and stand ready to defend them with the ferocity of a honey badger. Thank you very much. I'll now take your questions and I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Gad. I could talk to you all night. I have so many follow-up questions. I want to talk about the war on discernment and the Munchausen by proxy. The oppression Olympics, I think, is my favorite expression that you use. But there's so much to ask. Let's get right into the questions. And I want to start with a fundamental one. Do you think as conservatives or as people who are loving of liberty, we're at a fundamental disadvantage because innately we don't think about people in terms of groups. We value and respect the individual, and we tend not to think about how we can control other people. So you wrote a lot in your book about strategy. Do you think we're at an innate disadvantage?
By virtue of the fact that conservatives are not going to be sort of the collectivist hive mindset, is that what you mean?
Yes.
I mean, perhaps, but there are all sorts of other ways by which conservatives are at an advantage. So it really depends. It's difficult to sort of do a forensic accounting of, you know, whether the totality of the pros and cons of being conservative yields an advantage. I think what's better to do is to say, look, is my position one that is veridical, one that that has veracity, one that I could defend using the typization of marijuana? In Canada, we were the first to do so. My answer would be, you know what, Jane, I haven't done the requisite nomological network to be able to answer that with full assuredness, and therefore I'll be quiet. And therefore, my advantage is actually to, more than whether I'm a conservative or not, is that I am well calibrated in my epistemic humility. When I know something, I walk with the swagger and the self-assuredness of someone who is ready to go to battle to defend my position. When I don't know something, I have all of the epistemic humility necessary to say, you know what, I simply don't know enough. If you're only armed with that type of intellectual honesty, that already gives you an innate advantage. So it doesn't matter whether you're conservative or not. If truth is on your side, you will win the battle.
And there exactly is the intellectual honesty that's been missing, and that's what we're looking for. One of our audience members says, what places have the least idea pathogens now? Are there any pockets that have fewer?
Well, you would have liked to think that the military would have been, you know, one of the last vestiges of where, you know, that is not parasitized. But boy, are the progressive blue-haired people doing their best to make sure that that particular ecosystem is now fully parasitized, right? So if you look at almost all of the generals that get promoted to becoming generals, they're usually not, you know, MacArthur types and so on. They're the ones who toed the line, who say the right thing. I mean, I don't know if you saw, there was a great meme that was shared on social media where they juxtaposed next to each other the latest ad from the US military versus the latest ad from the Russian military. Did you see this one?
Didn't.
So the US one, it was, you know, kind of trying to cram every single woke principle. You know, I was raised by two mommies, Linda and Jane, and this is how I learned, right? And that's why I became a fighter pilot. So it's every single woke idea that fits within the recruitment strategy of the US Army. On the other hand, when it came to the Russian ad, it was a bunch of really intimidating looking commandos that, you know, reeked of, quote, toxic masculinity. So I would love to say to the person who asked the question that there's a place to hide from these idea pathogens, but the reality is that once they become to proliferate, it's really like a stage 4 cancer. It spreads really quickly. So there's no longer a nook and cranny where you don't find these bad ideas.
It has indeed spread. It seems almost like virtue signaling is like a full-time job for people. I don't know how they can squeeze it all in.
Right, true.
We had a previous speaker, June Gilliam, who was raised in China, recruited by the CCP. And she came to the States and she shared with us that it was a very slow and painful process, Dr. Saad, to recognize and accept that she had been lied to so profoundly in her upbringing. Do you think that I think we need a way for people to back away from bad ideas? Have you given some thought to how that might happen? In other words, how can we could protect their egos enough that they could consider some other ideas?
Yeah, you know, I've often thought about that exact issue because, so for example, if you take the nomological networks that I just mentioned earlier, that tool only works if the person to whom you're going to build that nomological network is willing to take their fingers out of their ear, right? Like, in other words, they have to at least have the ability to listen to your arguments. Once I can get you to take out your fingers from your ears, I think I then have done my homework to be able to start to sway you. But you're right, you know, our pet ideologies that form our identity are very, very difficult to eradicate, right? Because it's part of our sort of ego defensive strategies. Look, I know of some intellectuals, some of whom were previous friends of mine. Regrettably, I have to say it's in the past, because they weren't able to differentiate the fact that we might have differing opinions, yet still leave the door open for us still being friends. If I look at them, they built their careers on being supposedly nuanced, rational thinkers. But then when Orange Himmler won the presidency in 2016, they became genuinely pathologically hysterical psychiatric patients. Every single day on Twitter, it was a reiteration of the fact that, you know, we had only a few days left to live. He was about to marshal nuclear holocaust. You know, the economy was going to collapse. We're going to go back to a barter system because currency would be eradicated. This was the type of hysteria that you were hearing from people that supposedly were leading, you know, public intellectuals. So to those people, I'm afraid, I'm not sure that there's anything that I can do to get to them. So they've reached stage 4 lunacy. They're gone. They're non-redeemable, non-recuperable. But I think my optimistic side of me says that most people, if there's a way for you to spark their intellectual honesty, can come to the table, and then you drown them with evidence and hopefully you flip them over. The other thing, by the way, is that if you look at life history of an individual, most people will start off having, if they start off with these liberal, quote, liberal ideas, as they grow older, become more conservative. And so in the same way that criminals, one of the best ways to make sure that they become less violent is simply to let them age, because their testosterone goes down and naturally they become less aggressive. Maybe by letting some of the blue-haired people age a bit, they can become part of team rationality without much of an intervention.
I like the expression team rationality. It's very nice. I noticed some people seem forever allergic to facts, but we'll have hope with you. There are a couple of questions about the world of academia, your university life. One you just referred to, but I wonder if you might expand a little bit about how you've been treated by your colleagues. And secondly, about how things get funded. How does research get funded? How does all this parasitic research get funded?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of how I've been treated, I can assure you that contrary to what people think, a lot of people will think, oh, but you know, you're tenured, therefore there's nothing for you to worry about. There are endless ways by which you can pay very, very severe costs for being as outspoken as I am. So let's first discuss some of the costs that are not from within academia. So at one point, I was receiving so many death threats that I had to have security accompany me whenever I delivered a lecture at my university. So they would come to my class, lock the door so that if a student wanted to leave, they could leave. But if they wanted to come back in, the door was locked. They would be waiting for me when I would leave. And then when my wife would come pick me up, I would have something akin to like an anxiety, you know, reaction, because it was, oh my God, thank God I lived until next week's lecture. It got so bad that I had to go actually with a representative from my university to the Montreal police, not campus police, the Montreal police, to file a report with, you know, with the whole dossier of death threats that I had received and so on. So the idea that, you know, tenure somehow is the grand shield that protects you from all calamities is simply, it trivializes frankly, the courage that it takes to speak out the way that I do. In terms of my colleagues, most of them, what they've done is they've tried to ignore me, which itself can be quite punishing, right? So I won't get invited to the cool kids party but now, by the way, they will write to me privately saying how much I am their hero, right? So, dear Dr. Saad, I can't tell you how much my life in academia would have been unbearable were it not for you. Oh, and please, in case you're about to read this email on your show, please let me remind you, I would rather be anonymous, to which I usually respond, thank you for your kind words. Don't you think that the last sentence you wrote is the exact reason why we're facing this problem. Yes, yeah, I know, but you know, I don't have your courage. So the reality is, I think the silent majority, if you actually polled them in an anonymous way, would probably be on my side. But when it comes to their public proclamations, very, very few people stand by me, and it's regrettable. So that's the first question. The second question, in terms of the funding, well, now for most funding, never mind for all of this parasitic nonsense, if you want to receive funding in, you know, in psychology and neuroscience, in the natural sciences, you have to have a die statement. I mean, literally, if I were...
It's funny to me that they let that initial go, like they let it be die. I can't believe they didn't screen that.
Right. So I have a colleague of mine who's a physical chemist at a sister university here in Montreal, who's a, you know, very, you know, quite prominent physical chemist who's doing important scientific work. His most recent grant to the Canadian government didn't even make it to the stage where they were evaluating the actual content of his scientific grant, but rather the fact that he had failed at the first stage, which was his die statement. What, you know, what, and by the way, he is a quote brown person. Okay, so you know, the orgiastic self-cannibalism of all of this nonsense is truly extraordinary. And again, as someone who comes from Lebanon, who has seen what all of these dreadful ideas can have as outcomes, it amazes me that 45 years after having escaped Lebanon, all of these idiotic ideas are back in full force under the cloak and robe of progressivism. It's simply maddening.
It's maddening, and it's madness.
Right.
Right? It makes no sense at all. I'm going to jump back to the listener's question. Someone, one of our guests wrote, you refer to organized intellectual terrorism, assuming the greatest of human fears is the fear of loss of all types, from persecution, ostracization, through social media harassment, etc. Where and how can ardent defenders muster the numbers and the courage to challenge the organized intellectual terror of postmodern, especially for young people? There are several questions tonight, Dr. Saad, about young people, people who are sending their kids to college, people who are having children, young people come home from college angry and considering themselves victimized and indoctrinated.
So there are a couple of ways to answer this, and that's really what I try to do in the last chapter of the book, where I have a call to action. So number one, certainly don't diffuse the responsibility of your voice to others. Oh, you know what? I'm too busy preparing for my daughter's wedding. I'm too busy picking up the groceries today. I've got too much stress at work. Let Gad Saad worry about it. He seems like a big boy. He can handle it. I'm going to keep quiet. That instinct to diffuse responsibility is precisely what most people do, and hence it becomes what's called in economics tragedy of the commons, right? So at the very least, know that even though you may not have large enough influence, you don't have the podcast outreach of Joe Rogan, you may not have the fancy titles of Gad Saad, but that doesn't matter. You can still challenge your professor politely in class when they say something that is insane. You can challenge your friend at the pub when they say something that you disagree with. In other words, you can modulate your contribution to the battle of idea within whatever you feel comfortable, but just do something, right? All the cliches of, the journey starts with one step, the first ripple and so on. You have to feel empowered by that message, right? You don't have to have 25 million followers for you to throw your hat into the ring, right? And hence, that's why I say activate your inner honey badger. On a personal level, I think that, so people say to me, well, why is it that you're constantly involved? I mean, you already lead a very busy and stressful life as a professor. Why do you have to take on all these other things? My wife has asked me that. And my answer is the following. I have a very exacting code of personal conduct in the following way. It's now quite late here. In a few minutes, I'll be heading to bed after we have this lovely event. When I lay my head on the pillow, in order for me to not suffer from insomnia and feel that I am not a fraud, I have to know that I have done all that I could, however small or however large, to at least contribute to the battle of ideas. I never stopped myself from being a dogged defender of the truth. If I meet that exacting code of personal conduct, then I could sleep with my conscience clear. If I don't, then I would feel like a fraud. Since I don't want to feel like a fraud, and I'm driven by this code of honor and personal integrity, I always have to weigh in. In other words, so to draw an analogy, when you hear someone screaming in an alley that they're being mugged, there are two types of people. Someone passes by and they pretend they didn't hear the screams because they don't want to put themselves at risk. And then there's always someone who says, this is not right, I'm going to intervene. Be that person. This doesn't mean that you have to be a reckless martyr. I understand that people have certain fears. I understand that they don't want to lose their job and so on. But a few days ago, as Keone mentioned earlier, we had our 77th anniversary of the landing on Normandy and so on. That the young men who landed on Normandy, were they guaranteed safe passage? Or did most of them know that they were going to be mowed down like little mosquitoes by the German machine guns? So in a war, whether it be a physical war or an ideological war, a war of ideas, there's going to be some damage, there's going to be some cost to bear. And you can't simply say, I'm not willing to bear any of the costs. As long as we don't diffuse responsibility, we will all rise. Look, the silent majority hates this stuff. The reality is that if I could pull every single individual in terms of where they fall on the blue-haired continuum, there are very few blue-haired people, but they are the ones who hold the choke points of the intelligentsia. So very few people can keep the rest of us in check. Once we develop our collective voice together and rise up, we'll get rid of these parasitic ideas by next Tuesday. If we don't, it'll be a very, very slow train ride to hell.
I would really be pleased if it was next Tuesday. That would work perfectly for me. Some more questions. Is there a corollary to a vaccine, a tried and true real vaccine, that will cause an immune reaction against these parasitic ideas? Is there a corollary?
Well, I mean, the nomological networks of cumulative evidence is that vaccine, because it is an ordered method for adjudicating between competing positions. It's not a literature review. So for example, some people, and that's why in the book, I differentiate between the nomological networks that I spoke of. And a literature review is simply you describing what other people have done in your particular area of interest. So if you're studying, for example, does the consumption of coffee attenuate asthmatic symptoms? Well, I can do a literature review to see all of the studies that have been done on that exact phenomenon. That's not what a nomological network is. Nomological network is saying, what would be all the data that I could amass from across cultures, from across time periods, from across disciplines, from across methodologies, across metrics, which when I triangulate all these, prove that my position is the veridical one. So that is the grand epistemological vaccine. The difficulty though with this vaccine, if you like, is that it requires a lot of discipline, because to build a nomological network requires a lot of effort on your part. But for important topics, is Islam peaceful or not, we have to do the effort to build the nomological network to be able to definitively answer this really important question, right? So while it is effortful to get the global vaccine of the human mind, it truly is one that will inoculate us against bad ideas and allow us to seek truth.
You're getting all kinds of accolades online. I wanted to let you know, by the way, people texted me privately while you were speaking. They said they were applauding, clapping, and laughing as well. So know that your jokes.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Know that your jokes landed. There's a fellow Canadian writing, and he says, "Is it Canada or U.S. who's in deeper trouble in terms of being parasiticized?" I can't even.
Parasitized.
There you go.
Yeah.
He says, "Thanks and love your work, by the way."
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Certainly, Canada has been ahead, but the U.S. is doing its best to catch up. So, in other words, if you would have told me, and I mean, in part, the reason why Canada really started to, etch ahead is, as I said earlier, as I alluded to earlier, we have a prime minister who really truly embodies each of these, truly I mean, he's just a walking platitude of every single one of the woke cliches you could think of. I mean, he genuinely cannot utter a single syllable that isn't one of those woke things. So it's you just do a permutation of climate change, diversity, inclusion, equity, just come up with different permutations. That's every one of his speeches. And so I would have said that Canada is ahead, but given the win of Noble Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I think you guys are well on your way to catching up.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Well, hold off on the congratulations if you wouldn't mind. I want to share this question. It's from a high school senior.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he says, speaking of college, he said, I'm using my dad's laptop right now. The University of Washington, where I live, recently abolished the SAT requirement, weighing everything on personal essays.
Yes.
Is it better to study abroad or to study in the US? And can I dodge affirmative action this way? He wants to know.
Well, what's his skin If his skin is, depending on what his skin is, will determine whether he should play the game or not. Although I would never suggest that he should play. But I'm guessing he's a white student. Is that the gist of the question?
I have no more information than I gave you. But
I would say it's not a question of whether you shouldn't go to the U.S. or it's that you should first find a school that, to the best of your ability, you can gauge the extent to which they have been parasitized. The reality is that no school is free of these idea pathogens, or very few schools are. But what you can certainly do is choose to not study in disciplines that are defined by a commitment to these parasitic ideas. Now, again, this is not a denigration. Oftentimes people mistake my positions as being one where I'm denigrating the humanities or some of the social sciences. Not at all. You can study very seriously and with great intellectual rigor topics in the humanities or in the social sciences or in the natural sciences. So this is not an attack on a particular discipline, but it's rather an attack on some disciplines that have become completely devoid of a quest to seek truth, but rather to be blue-haired activists. So you're very unlikely to be able to study English literature anywhere where it isn't parasitized by all the woke stuff. But to contrast that, you could study literature from a very scientific perspective. As a matter of fact, let me link it to my own work. There's a field called literary Darwinian criticism. This is where you study literary narratives via a Darwinian lens. The idea being that the reason why literature moves us so much, the idea why someone from Pakistan or Nigeria or ancient Greece or today in Silicon Valley can read the same poem and completely understand the sentiments that are being expressed by the poet is because that poet is referring to certain biologically shared human universals, right? And so you can use evolutionary psychology to study literature. So it's not that the humanities are not amenable to intellectual rigor, it's that they have been fully parasitized. So to that young person, young man or woman, I would simply say, make sure that you don't waste your time and your parents' hard-earned money studying BS that's only going to brainwash you. Study something that allows you to intellectually grow.
I enjoyed your holy trinity of BS earlier in our conversation as well. Can a nation survive that celebrates and rewards being easily offended?
In the long run, no. I mean, so this is why I argue that many of the dire predictions that I offer are not meant to be hyperbolic. I'm being literal, but I'm using a longer window or temporal period. So I'm not saying, so when for example, I say, look, if you instantiate all of this identity politics in the West, you will have a repeat of the Lebanon that I escaped. I don't mean that we will have house-to-house civil war, by next Friday. But if you give it 50, 100 years, and when I say 50 to 100 years, a lot of people say, oh, that's too long, you're being too optimistic. But in other words, my predictions are usually not based on the fact that I expect these phenomena to, head down the slippery slope by next Friday, but that if you eradicate all of the foundational values that made the West the anomalous outlier that it is, then you're going to have exactly what you have in every other society from which people like me escaped, right? And it's no surprise, it's no accident that some of the most dogged defenders of Western values are not the people who went to Wellesley and who are named Jones and so on. It's usually immigrants who have seen the panoply of buffet societies that are not like the West, who then come to the West precisely because they recognize the beauty of the West, and they say, hey guys, what the hell are you doing? You're insane. And so I think that, you know, give it enough time, the West will die if it continues on its path.
Yeah, we look forward to hosting a panel of immigrants because I think their voices are so credible and they can warn us, because we've become kind of just too comfortable. Evidently, we don't understand what we're losing here. So the elephant in the living room. Let's acknowledge COVID and all the pandemic and the shutdowns and all that. I'm going to consolidate a few questions here. There was a question about why Canada is acquiescing to the tyrannical lockdowns. They wonder why Canada is not protesting. And we are asked how you feel about the restrictions in the churches and the hotels, et cetera. And then when you answer that, I want to ask you a more specific question about protocol.
You know, maybe I'm being stereotypical about sort of the Canadian ethos, but we're just nice and polite and so on. And so, and I regret that it's that, because I think that there is certainly justification for people to be a lot more upset and indignant than they currently have been. I'd like to draw an analogy when I'm often asked about this, you know, the sort of the general COVID question that you asked me. So if you think about optimal parenting, one of the things that you want in optimal parenting is that the child knows exactly the sequence of behaviors that will result in rewards or that will result in punishment. Now imagine if you take away that statistical regularity from the child, so that when he does A, he doesn't know if he's going to be scolded or hugged and rewarded. Then
well, that's exactly what happens in borderline parenting, right? I mean, we know what.
Exactly. So now I'm going to analogize with COVID, right? If you told me, here are the exact metrics by which us, the government, are going to restrict A or B or whatever, then we would all think of this as a form of consistent parenting. Here are the rules, and then we'll play along. But on the other hand, what you have is a form of mind blank. I'm not going to say what the blank is, whereby it's completely ad hoc. It's seat of the pants stuff. It's the vagaries of whomever is, right? I mean, I've never heard someone say, based on this exact epidemiological model, this is why you're only allowed 4 people in the boat, but not 6, or this number of people to be in your backyard, but not this number. And so what ends up happening is you have a form of existential angst because you can't plan for anything, right? So I receive a million invitations to speak all over the place. I always have to say, I don't know when my overlord, you know, Lord Justin Trudeau will grant me the freedom to resume personal agency. So it's a very, very difficult reality. But I think, though, I'd like to think that we are reaching the end of this. I can't imagine how much longer this could go on, but who knows?
Okay, so let me get in one more COVID question. Do you have an opinion, our listener asks, on the lack of intellectual honesty in terms of the origin of the Wuhan virus or the lack of COVID-19 early treatments that are?
Well, certainly the lab leak theory seems to be, I mean, it's kind of like, if I'm going to analogize, so O.J. Simpson has his DNA on the 2 murdered people. The 2 murdered people have their DNA on him. His shoe print is, you know, at the scene. His glove is at the scene. And by the way, when this thing came up, there were some lawyers that had gone on TV and said that if you had taken all of the evidence against O.J. Simpson and took all of it together, it would amount to more evidence than if you took 10 cases that led to the death penalty. That's the extent of how much evidence there was against O.J. Simpson, and yet there was the nullification of the jury, right? Blah, 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 I don't want to hear it. And so it amazes me, the number of people, again, many of the, quote, public intellectuals that I adhered, that I alluded to earlier with some disdain, they are exactly the ones who continue to say that it's, it's racist to argue. So it almost is difficult to imagine how someone could be parasitized to this level. I mean, surely there is more evidence than less evidence that this probably leaked from the Wuhan lab, but I know tons of otherwise very smart people who say, no, that's just pure racism. That's xenophobia till today. And so I can't explain it other than to say that's the power of what parasitic ideas can do to a brain. They turn it into mush.
Quite powerful. Let's talk about, do you have time for a few more, Gad? Can we ask
Do
you a
it.
couple questions?
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to get this one in because circling back to the very smart people you're talking about, one of our listeners wants to know if the supermajority college faculties at least know the lopsided nature of their membership. Do they believe both sides are adequately represented, and if they do know, do they ever feel guilt about it?
Usually, you talk about the supermajority, the 130 to 0, and that's not the, okay. Usually, here's the typical answer I receive, and I actually addressed it in the Parasitic Mind, and it reeks of such myopia and intellectual dishonesty, if not complete lack of theory of mind. So usually the argument goes as follows. Well, professors are smart, they're educated, therefore, of course, they're going to be liberal and Democrats, because by definition, smart and educated people should be liberal. So what do you expect them to be? I mean, imagine how idiotic that position is, right? So it's almost like someone saying, well, the revealed truth of my religion is true because it says so in my book, which is the revealed truth. Right? It's a form of like orgiastic tautology. So they typically won't admit that there is the bias. When you show them the data, as I did in the slide in today's talk, then they will say, but okay, so there is that bias, but you would expect it because we're dealing with smart people. So what they would argue is it is impossible to understand how a professor could not be a liberal. Something must be wrong with that person. And we will truly achieve equity when we no longer have a Republican professor. Then we will have reached nirvana in academia.
Okay. So you would like us to be honey badgers. You'd like us to stay engaged. What else do you recommend?
Don't diffuse responsibility onto others, but believe that your voice matters. I know a lot of people who started channels, they reached out to me, they had 0 followers, and then they just opened the laptop, opened the camera, and now they have, I mean, they don't have Joe Rogan following, but they're making a difference. So in other words, I just want people to feel empowered that there are no in today's world where there are truly incredible tools that allows people to connect with one another. You have no excuse to not weigh in. Just, you have to believe that your voice matters. Even if you change the minds of 3 of your Facebook friends, that's better than had you not done that effort. So I recognize that people should not be reckless martyrs. Not everybody has the same level of courage. Not everybody has the same protections. Not everybody has the same tolerance for taking risks. I get all that. But from whichever reality that you are operating from, you should do more rather than less. The instinct of most people is to simply say, I just don't have the capacity to weigh in on this because I'm going to get skewered, I'm going to get e-mobbed, I'm going to get fired, my friends. For example, one of the things I often get is I will lose friendships. And then I write this in the Parasitic Mind, I say friendships should be anti-fragile, meaning that they should be able to withstand the stressor of us having different opinions. You maybe love Justin Trudeau, I don't love Justin Trudeau, and our friendship should be able to withstand that difference. If it doesn't, then don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. In other words, there's an expression in French, which I'll first say it in French and then I'll translate it in English. Mieux vaut être seul que mal accompagné. It is better to be alone than to be poorly accompanied. So I don't want friends who are only willing to be my friends as long as I agree that Trump is worse than ISIS. And if I don't agree, then they're no longer going to be my friends. I have very famous public intellectuals who disassociated with me because I was apparently not sufficiently disdainful of Trump. It's insane. It's lunacy.
So I'm going to close with a question for you about optimism. It's a question about, could you consider yourself an optimist? Based on what historical evidence should we have optimism, and how do you maintain yours?
Yeah, I am very optimistic. I do wake up many days where, you know, I feel like we're going backwards, but I truly believe that the numbers are in our favor. It just, you know, when you're trying to start a fire and you do 100 times and then the 101st time it finally catches and now you have a fire. Well, I always view each of my engagements today on this platform. Maybe there is someone who is going to be ignited by something that I said and feel invigorated and say, you know what, I'm going to challenge my professor tomorrow. I'm going to start my new YouTube channel or podcast. I'm going to write an op-ed. I'm going to go to the parent-teaching meeting and talk against critical race theory to my 7-year-old. So that's what gives me optimism, which basically the idea that by repetitive imploring to people to get engaged, people will wake up, the domino effect will start, and then it will go much more quickly than you would think. In other words, as I said earlier, sort of in a hyperbolic way, by next Tuesday it will be over. It may not be next Tuesday, but things can quickly turn around. I'll give you a very quick example. Christopher Rufo is a gentleman that very few people knew until very recently. He became the central repository of all things critical race theory, and through his activism, which he fell into it in a serendipitous way, there's now all sorts of activism going all over the United States where, you know, state legislatures are banning critical race theory. Well, 6 months ago, we couldn't have predicted such a quick turnaround, and yet now it's really picking up. So that's what gives me optimism, is that if I thought that the demographic reality of the parasitized people were 97% were blue-haired and only 3% were people who are coming to this forum, then I would be very pessimistic. But the reality is that 97% are the silent majority that we would all agree with, and only the 3% blue-haired people are ruling the rest of us. Once we muster the courage to fight back against the 3%, this whole nightmare will be over quickly. That's what gives me optimism.
Okay, well, that's a wonderful way to end it. Thank you, Dr. Saad. Thank you for offering your direct, your courageous, and insightful voice to us tonight. I've been greatly looking forward to hosting you and appreciate you staying up late with us to deliver your wisdom and warmth to Silicon Valley.
You're very kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you.